Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this evening's safeguarding briefing. This is the first of the new academic year 2020. I'm not sure it's the start to the academic year that we were hoping for back in May and June. We are still in the midst of very difficult times, which we'll talk a bit more about this evening. But a very, very warm welcome to everybody for this evening's briefing. Over the summer, since my last briefing, which was the end of July, there haven't been a huge number of changes. But what we're going to look at this evening, as we do on our briefings, are a few things. So we're going to look at what's been happening in the world of safeguarding, some of the things to be aware of. Are there any legal updates that we need to consider? And also finally thinking about what affects you and what's coming up inside the association that you can get involved in and might be of use to you over the coming weeks, months and academic year. So as I say, in terms of what's been happening since my last briefing in July, there's been an awful lot happening around reports being published. So if you're a regular subscriber to my newsletter, then you'll have seen certainly last week's newsletter had a number of reports that have come out. You'll also be aware that there have been numerous government guidance coming out in terms of what the new academic year should look like and how we should be approaching that. There's still more guidance awaited. Not everywhere has had the benefit of government guidance, and it's not always the clearest when it has been released. So we cannot continue today's briefing without really a reflection on the pandemic. We are still in the midst of it. It's not as deep or horrific as it was in sort of April, May, June time, but it is still very much a big issue. It's affecting certainly the return back to school, to education, to treatments, to offices, into wider extracurricular activities. It is having an enormous impact. And I really can't say too much about it and express how enormous its impact has been. What we need to be aware as practitioners are the kind of big things coming out of this. And if you've seen some of the reports, you will see that the numbers are really high. They are not at all dropping. There have been increased numbers of calls about domestic abuse, increased numbers of calls to refuge services, an increased number of calls to Childline, and an increased number of interventions that local authorities have been asked to do. So it is big across the board. There is also the added complication for us, certainly for those working within education, in terms of the latest, in terms of government guidance that has been released. And that guidance talks about health and safety. Now, we know health and safety is important in our schools. We know that that is absolutely something we have to be considering. But there's been a very key change in language from government that talks about workforce rather than staff. That very much puts us in the realm of the Health and Safety Executive and the implications that has for employers, which schools are, charities are, all of those others. If you've got staff, people who are employed by you, you are an employer, and therefore you have responsibilities for health and safety at work. So there's a lot of things happening, and I know from talking to numerous designated safeguarding leads that your plans have been written and rewritten, have been tested and retested, and now we're at the start of the new academic year with students. Some were back to school last week, some are starting this week, but it's very much we've got our plans, but will they work and how will they operate in practice? So a huge trying and testing time, not just in terms of the plans and processes, that have been put in place, but also in terms of the emotional strain that this will take on all staff and on students as well. Because we're not simply talking about a return to the workforce that we knew, or return to the organisation that we knew, or the school setting that we knew. There are new things that have had to happen. There are new processes in place, students starting in bubbles, the implications of them breaking those bubbles intentionally or otherwise is a new dimension that we're all trying to get our heads around. For those working in an extracurricular way, dance schools, sports clubs, things like that, lots are back, but that does have an added difficulty to it. So I know lots of governing bodies have been releasing independent guidance about what they expect to happen, and certainly we're seeing changes. If we look at what's happening even at the Premier League level, there's a lot of things happening there, and certainly it's the England game tonight. My husband's downstairs watching it, but we've had players sent home for breaching COVID-19 restrictions there as well. So this is an enormous issue that is still continuing. It is going to continue. It's something that is evolving on an almost daily basis, perhaps not the hourly basis we were seeing right at the start, but it is absolutely something that is evolving. We know that there are things coming out from a safeguarding perspective, but we're also aware that there are other things we need to be considering as part of our return to workspaces, to schools, to organisations as well. So what else is going on? Well, we've still got a lot of working from home, and we also have to be aware of remote learning. There is within the updated DfE guidance, an absolute that there has to be remote learning available for those students who are either self-isolating or if there is a local lockdown. It's not clear whether or not we're going to have a full lockdown. I know that's something the government are saying they do not want to happen, but we need to be aware that it's a possibility, and absolutely local lockdowns are a real possibility. But what the guidance is making very clear is that the curriculum must be able to be taught in an online way. So it will not be appropriate to simply be sending some links out, as I know some schools were doing throughout the early part of lockdown. This is absolutely a full curriculum and must be taught. In terms of remote learning and working from home, I know that lots of schools and colleges are facing applications from staff for remote working to continue. Some are able to honour that, but others aren't. Very much depends on the needs of the service and what is happening. But that's a workspace that I think we're going to have to keep a very close eye on. I suspect that over the coming months, and certainly over the coming year, as we move through into the autumn and the winter time, and we see what's happening with this virus, and also the impact it's having on changing working and living practices and general ways of life, that lots of jobs that were done in the office may well move to a more remote access point. And lots of schools and colleges are now looking at a digital way of delivery as a permanent feature to add to their portfolio of face-to-face lessons as well. Online safety is still a huge issue, and I don't know who has seen the latest around TikTok and OnlyFans. OnlyFans is still one of those sites that is very much on the red alert list. And TikTok has had a viral video in the last 24 hours, I believe, which is effectively covered up with fluffy bunnies, cats and dogs, but is a very graphic image behind it of somebody killing themselves. It is really, really awful that's got onto that platform. I've seen a number of warnings about it over the last 24 hours. So be aware of that there are emerging things occurring as we go through, certainly with the likes of these new platforms that are evolving as well. And finally, I really want to just touch on these new Ofsted visits that are occurring. In my role as independent safeguarding chair, I will be partaking in one of those later this week, and I'll be sharing my experience with members of the Safeguarding Association next week as to how that went and the sorts of the kind of things that the Ofsted are looking for very generally. Obviously, we'll not be sharing any confidential information in that at all, but it's something to be aware of, that we have new visits ahead of full inspections happening perhaps later on in the year. So there's lots of things emerging in terms of how Ofsted are going to approach this. They will now send letters after a visit rather than a judgment, because they're not seeing documentation, but they are talking to students, to staff, and so we'll be publishing letters about the visit that they've had. So that is something to be aware of. As a note at the moment, we are being assured by Ofsted that they aren't going to use those letters retrospectively. So if they're going for a full inspection, say in June next year, but you were visited in October 2020, that they wouldn't be looking at those letters. However, whilst individual inspectors may not, I do find it very hard to believe that in some way these visits, these professional discussions, won't form the basis for some further decision making later down the line. I hope I'm wrong. I hope that the Ofsted are true to their word on this, but I am cautious about what that could mean for organisations, particularly given we have within the guidance the specific mention of safeguarding, talking about online safety as well. So I'm anticipating that there will be a reflective process and perhaps not in the way we normally think about reflective processes, but certainly a reflection on what was happening when lockdown happened, how organisations, schools, colleges, extracurricular activities were focusing, or how they managed online safety, how they managed safeguarding generally throughout that time period. Again, I'm aware that there has been a huge disparity and a huge divergence in practice as and across the country. It is not isolated to any one area at all. Some schools have been providing full lessons. They've been providing lessons through Teams, through other Google Classroom, through other platforms for a full school day for children and young people. Others have gone to the other extreme, where they have sent maybe 1 or 2 links once a week, if that. I'm also aware, in terms of safeguarding practice, we've got those schools on the one side who have had all of their staff, from a safeguarding perspective, have been updating their training, have been using their time. If they haven't been teaching full lessons, then they've been using their time to develop their skills. They've also got entire safeguarding teams who've been ringing, who've been checking in on a daily basis with those on their vulnerable registers, those that they're aware of who fit and there are concerns around safeguarding issues. And then on the other extreme, I'm aware of schools who have furloughed their designated safeguarding lead. So it is a very, very divergent picture. And so I imagine that Ofsted, in having these professional conversations, will be wanting to see what has happened, how that's worked, and also to try and get a feel for how schools are coping now everything's back, for how organisations are coping, and how we can move forward in a meaningful way to the, hopefully, for the benefit of our students, if nothing else. So I imagine there'll be similar conversations happening in other governing bodies. Certainly, if we think about some of the other things that have been happening, the white report, or the white review rather, into the gymnastics sex abuse and other abuse issues going on there. There's a whole host of things coming out in terms of how we need to be working and supporting our young people much better than we maybe have been doing previously in certain areas. The other thing to note throughout lockdown, I mentioned in the last briefing that there was a big increase in the number of separations and in the number of domestic abuse incidences. The other thing that has been reported recently is that the Trussell Trust, who are responsible for an awful lot of the food banks up and down the country, they've reported that in April, they saw a 95% increase in emergency food parcels. I suspect that's still very high. Those latest figures I haven't yet been able to obtain, but it is, with everything else, it's a worrying picture. And we know that those who are in poverty often then become even more vulnerable to some of the other abuses that can take place. So it is a very worrying picture. Certainly if you then factor in the number of redundancy notices. There was a report out in the BBC today that doing a Freedom of Information request, they found the forms that are completed, they have to be submitted to government if you are looking at making more than 20 staff members redundant. Of the HR1 forms, that's the form you submit, there were approximately 150,000 jobs at risk from some very big names. So that then has to be factored into those jobs that we've already lost. There was something like 500,000 jobs that had gone as a result of COVID, well, as a result of partly COVID, possibly other reasons as well. Certainly COVID is being cited as a major factor in that. We also know that in August, the amount of furlough dropped to 60%, with employers being asked to top up the rest. We know that the furlough scheme is due to finish in October. So that then brings in a potential raft of further redundancies in October. It is it's a sad and scary picture, because we know as safeguarding professionals that where you have poverty, where you have joblessness, you have increases in stresses, you have increases then in the emotional or the inability to regulate emotionally from children and from adults, with all of this other activity ongoing. So it's a very, it's a worrying picture, but it's one that as safeguarding professionals, we must be steeling ourselves for and be prepared for in the coming months. I am fairly certain that in the next briefing in 6 weeks' time, I will be talking in very similar terms, perhaps with more figures. But it is, I suppose this is a bit of a warning from me that I am fearful of where this is taking us and what we are potentially going to be seeing as safeguarding professionals over the coming weeks and months. And so now, right at the start of the academic year, we can hope for better, but we have to be prepared for a very difficult situation for lots of our students that is only going to get worse. The picture doesn't look like it's getting any better necessarily, but there is a divergence between those who are doing well and those who are not. So that is getting bigger. That gap is getting much, much bigger. And we need to be aware of the risks that come from this lower end, where there's increased unemployment, there's increased poverty, where there is increased tension, stresses. We know as professionals that causes umpteen problems. And as a result, we have to be mindful that yes, we can be making referrals, yes, we can be pushing for strategy meetings, but let's be brutally honest right now. A lot of these cases are not going to meet threshold unless something significant happens. Lots of these cases will be families that have never, ever come across your radar before. So as a professional, you are going to have to be watchful for things like this coming out of the woodwork, mindful of those children that you've never before seen or that tutors have never before been worried about, and making sure that you are you have effective processes in place to catch them early, because I suspect you are going to be the support system for these families. I don't imagine that the likes of early help are going to have any increased capacity to assist at all. So it's definitely something to be mindful of and to be aware of. Okay, let's move on to some legal updates now. There aren't very many, if I'm absolutely honest. The one I want to talk about really is the domestic abuse bill, which is still a bill. It's still going through Parliament, so we're not quite there yet. It is. I know there's still a lot of discussion around certain provisions within the bill, but it is something just to keep an eye on. I'm hoping that when we have our next briefing in 6 weeks' time, that I will be able to give you some more information in relation to it. But at the moment, it's just a note that it's still there. It's still happening. It's still going through Parliament, and we're waiting for it to be given royal assent. But there's a lot of debate with certain sections of it that are still causing some consternation by some of the action groups. Also, the Adoption and Children Coronavirus Amendments Regulations. You may recall that this is the piece of legislation that caused a huge outcry because it removed 65 safeguards for children in care pretty much overnight in April. So there was a big judicial review that went before the Court of Appeal in July, and the Court of Appeal said, actually, no, there wasn't anything there that was the court. No, it was the High Court. Sorry, went before the High Court, and the High Court said no. It's the government actually acted lawfully. There was nothing unlawful there. This month, most of those which were suspended, most of those safeguards which were suspended, are back. But my cautionary note is there is still some flexibility for local authorities. So it may well be that some of the things that we're expecting back don't come back. And this might be a bit of a movable feast over the coming months. It very much depends on the kind of impact on the services that we may see. So it's definitely something to keep an eye on, definitely something to keep watch on in terms of potential progression as well. So be aware of that. Okay, before we move on to this, I do want to talk about this because it is hitting the press, and it doesn't necessarily affect us as safeguarding leads, but we do need to be mindful of what is happening on the kind of international political stage at the moment. And particularly looking at the UK, we have in the next 8 weeks Brexit. So we need to be aware of the deadlines in relation to that. This last weekend, we saw massive protests in Dover. We know that there are huge issues in relation to migrants and asylum seekers coming into this country, which is causing big and huge feelings on both sides of the argument. We have to be aware as safeguarding professionals that our young people are at really great risk in certain areas, more so than others, of being radicalized into the far right. We are seeing what's happening across in America at the moment with the rhetoric that's coming across from the president. It is reaching things like YouTube, TikTok. It's reaching some of those other platforms that children talk to each other across on their gaming devices. We cannot think that this is never going to happen here. We know that's one of the big things we have to consider, but we must, as safeguarding professionals, be aware that there is a very real risk of increased far-right activity and that our young people may well be radicalised into it. So you have to be alert to this. I would suggest that if you feel you are in an area where there is greater risk of far-right activity, and you should know whether you are in one such area, then you need to be actively increasing the knowledge around this with your tutors and your staff, so that they are aware of it and they are able to deal with it in a very timely fashion. There are a number of organisations that do a lot of work around prevent and radicalisation. I suggest you will probably have some locally to you who you can tap into. If you don't know of anybody and this is an area you want to get better knowledge around, then send me a message. If you're watching this on the replay, then you can leave a comment underneath, or you can, if you're part of the Facebook group, then you can send me a message in the Facebook group, and I will get back to you there with some of those details. But it is something we cannot ignore, and we really have to be aware of the wider implications for that from a safeguarding perspective. So radicalisation, I've mentioned, there are also other issues that come out of that. We've potentially got gang-based violence coming out as a result of that, potentially more county lines issues as a loop in with all of that. So it isn't something that is going to stand necessarily in isolation. We really must be mindful of the wider implications that we've got for our young people. This really not only difficult in terms of a global pandemic happening, but also really difficult politically, which is really putting a strain on lots of families, but it's also causing a huge divergence in opinions and attitudes as well. So something to be very, very aware of. Okay. So what else do we need to consider? Well, this is pretty much what we were talking about in July. We need to think about the impact of separation on our young people. Those rates haven't dropped. In fact, they're going up. So we know that there is an impact on our young people when their parents separate. So be mindful of that. Be mindful in terms of your record keeping, that you have got everybody doing what they need to do and sharing it sensibly. Information sharing. Now more than ever, we need to be making sure we're sharing timely and we're doing it in a safe way. Make sure that you're thinking, and now in contact information, something that came up during the focus week I was running a couple of weeks ago was in relation to track and trace. As part of track and trace, it is a requirement that anybody coming into your establishment needs to say, give you their name and their phone number. I think that's the minimum requirement. Don't quote me on that. You'll need to double check that. However, any information given there is purely for track and trace purposes. Something that has come up recently was a discussion around how that information is stored and how it's recorded. So if you're recording on, say, so if I go into my office and I've got my PA or my VA comes in, or I see a client in the office, if I was to do that, then they would have to complete a track and trace form that would get posted. It comes out on a piece of paper, and when they leave, they put their details on there and they post it in the little box that's waiting at the exit. That's one way. That information is sealed. Nobody else can touch it other than the person with the key, who then is responsible for track and trace. However, what I'm hearing are lots of organisations who are trying to do this electronically. So you might have a sign-in pad. And I see this in lots of establishments. There is a tablet device that's on the front desk, and when you go in, you put your name in, you usually put your car registration number in. You see this in hotels up and down the country. Remember when we could go to hotels? You put your car registration details in, and you put other details in that you needed, and that was it. So it's a similar thing that I'm seeing happening in lots of schools and organisations. So they're putting name in, telephone number in, off it goes. Now, what we need to be mindful of is, where is that information then stored, and does it link to a pupil's records? And the answer has not been easy to ascertain when designated safeguarding leads have gone back to check this, because I can see a situation whereby you have a family in crisis. Maybe the social worker involved has desperately been trying to get hold of grandma and granddad to come in for an assessment. Maybe they need to talk to them for a variety of reasons, but mum has flatly refused to give them grandma's phone number or contact details. And so you might then get a savvy social worker who says, actually, I know grandma drops the kids off at school. Now under track and trace, they've got to leave their phone and their name and phone number. So I'm going to send this off to, I'm going to ask the school for that information. Now, that information, if it's done for track and trace, is for track and trace purposes only. I can see, if you are not careful, a very, very, very big mire of GDPR issues if you aren't dealing with this data correctly. So if you haven't thought this through already, now is the time to be doing it and making sure that in terms of the information you've got as track and trace, it is not being put with other data that you've got for that child, because otherwise, I suspect, again, you need to take proper advice on this, but I suspect you're in breach of the track and trace processes. So you will need to be very, very careful about what you're doing with it, how you're storing it, and where you're putting it. So be very, very mindful of that. Okay. In terms of court orders, that's simply a reminder that you need to be checking. If somebody says that somebody's not allowed contact, are they? Is there a court order in place? Is there a reason why that can't happen? Also checking in terms of whether or not anybody's got parental responsibility that didn't have it previously, or are the children still living where they were previously? And if not, is there a court order to that effect? And maybe there needs to be some conversation about how that situation has come about. And finally, just to think about your online blended learning concerns, making sure that you've got online safety right up there in terms of what you're delivering and talking to staff and students about. So that's the end of our safeguarding briefing. I want to thank you so much for watching and being part of this. Just a couple of things that are coming up in the next few weeks. If you're looking for designated safeguarding lead refresher training, then I'm running a full day session on the 1st of October. And if you're looking for initial training, so initial designated safeguarding lead training for any of your staff, then I'm running an open course for that on the 14th and 15th of October as well. So again, please get in touch and let's have a conversation about whether it's right for you, and I can send you the necessary booking forms. Or if you know it's right for you, you can head straight to the safeguardingassociation.com, and you will find the safeguarding lead and initial training in our training section in the shop area. So really easy ways to find that there. Oh, excuse me. So all that's left to say is have a lovely, lovely evening. I wish you the best of luck for the new term, and I will see you in 6 weeks' time, if not sooner. Bye for now.